Hey there, welcome to First Look. And it's been a minute since you and I have done this together because I was on vacation last week, and so I didn't get a chance to do all of this. I was lucky enough to be in Maine for the week and had a wonderful time and got to see a lot of the state from different vantage points and cities and that kind of thing. And so it was great. And now I'm kind of jumping right back into a week that's busy. We had this morning we started our mission week, which is a local day-to-day thing that we're doing here in the city, and this happens to be with NHCO's community garden, which is in Bellevue. And so on the morning time, because if we did it in the afternoon, I think we would all melt. We are going out Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday to this community garden and doing some work. And so a few folks came out this morning with me, and that was wonderful. And then we'll have some more folks come out later in the week. So if you want to join us, just let me know, and we'll get you out there. But for now, what we're doing is kind of looking at our next text here in August. And we're back now in the Gospels, and we've been kind of back and forth the last several weeks. But we were in Hebrews last week, and I didn't get to do a whole first look on Hebrews, but hopefully I gave you kind of enough in the sermon itself to kind of give you an idea of the context of that book. It's one of my favorite books, and it's one that I've looked at many times. So if you didn't get a chance to hear the sermon on that, then hopefully that will give you some of that. But this is Luke chapter 12, verses 49 through 56. And this week I think is the gospel version of a little bit of what we've been doing the last few weeks. And by that I mean, it's been a lot of kind of not correction as much as warning. It's like the people that are being spoken to should be on higher alert in terms of how they're living, what they should expect from each other, from themselves, and then what their hope is for the world. So it's a lot of kind of convicting, strong, really direct language about the state of the world and the state of people's hearts, minds, and souls. And so this passage doesn't, beat around the bush, I think, when it comes to the way that Jesus wants the people to understand his role in the world and their role in the world. So with that in mind, let me get to it. So again, this is Luke chapter 12, verses 49 through 56. So let me start here. And right off the bat, Jesus just goes right after it. I came to bring fire to the earth, and how I wish it were already kindled. So already very provocative, very attention getting. I have a baptism with which to be baptized, and what stress I am under until it is completed. Do you think that I have come to bring peace to the earth? No, I tell you, but rather division. I'm here to bring division. From now on, 5 in one household will be divided, 3 against 2 and 2 against 3. And they will be divided, father against son, son against father, mother against daughter, daughter against mother, mother-in-law against her daughter-in-law, and vice versa. And he also said to the crowds, when you see a cloud rising in the west, you immediately say, oh, it's going to rain. And so it happens. And when you see the south wind blowing, you say, oh, there's going to be a scorching heat, and it happens. You hypocrites. You know how to interpret the appearance of the earth and sky, but why do you not know how to interpret the present time? Just kind of looking ahead there. Why do you not know how to interpret the present time? So there's a lot there in a very short amount of time. And it's intentionally provocative and it's intentionally provoking of a response of anxiety, I think of a kind of a fear, but also to rouse a kind of passion within the people. So because it's always important to kind of know where you have been, let me give you kind of a little bit of context for Luke chapter 12. So Luke 12 kind of goes through these themes. And so I think that usually when Jesus is kind of doing these exhortations on different ideas, it's really important, especially important, to kind of understand what the author has laid out for us. Because one of the things that I try to explain as well as I can is that the writers of Scripture are also editors, right? So if you think about the things that Jesus did in his ministry, obviously he didn't just always stand there and talk on these different subjects endlessly, right? The author is putting together little stories, which in biblical scholar terms are called pericopes. So these little stories, these snippets, these pericopes, the editor, the author of the gospel, is cutting and pasting together on purpose. Not because they think that they might know better than Jesus, but to try to give you a sense of their perspective on what Jesus's goal is, right? So on some level, they are editing the gospel like a movie. And if you have different authors or editors or script writers or directors making a movie, you could have the same subject matter and get very different films with a very different sense. And the Gospels are a little bit like that. And so if you remember, Luke is set up in a way that it's trying to reach a new audience, right? Luke is intentionally expanded to look beyond the Jewish population and to look, in addition to that, to a Gentile population. So one of the things that we think about when we read Luke, right? Anything you read in Luke has to be read through that kind of lens, at least on some level, okay? So here's some of the, with that in mind, here's some of the pieces and subheadings for Luke chapter 12, okay? So it starts off with, in verse 1 through 3, a warning against hypocrisy, right? So it's like right faith, right learning, right understanding, okay? And then this says an exhortation to fearless confession, okay? So there's something about being kind of right before God, right in speech, and then having a sense of vulnerability, okay? So then we pivot from there to the parable of the rich fool. And the parable of the rich fool, of course, is talking about what we trust in, right? Trusting in yourself, trusting in possessions and that kind of thing, your abundance, or trusting in God instead, which you can see the parallels, obviously, between, being honest and vulnerable and then relying not on worldly goods, but on God, okay? So then it pivots from there to a little bit more explanation on that. So it says things like, do not worry. What can you add by worry? So there's there's that sense of trying to get the people to give of themselves and give their allegiance and trust in God instead of into their own wherewithal. Okay? So from there, it pivots again into a couple other parables. One about watchful slaves, basically those who are vigilant and ready to act, and then the difference between faithful and unfaithful slaves. Okay, which is all about, like, if you're thinking the right way and you're giving yourself over to God and you're trusting God, then you can be vulnerable, or you can be vulnerable enough to act with a sense of compliance and compassion, and with your goals aimed towards the will of God and not your own. Okay, so then that's the context, right? And then it goes right into this example here where Jesus is saying, I did not come to bring peace, but division. Okay, so how do we draw the lines between chapter 12, going from, looking at God's will, trusting in God's will, the actions that are reflective of us trusting in God, to division? So, Jesus does all of that and then says, I came to bring fire to the earth, and how I wish it were already kindled. You wouldn't wish it was already kindled if the people were already trusting in God, were already putting down their own pride, putting down their own, like looking out for themselves. If they were already in a place where they were trusting in God and trusting in God's will, then there wouldn't be any reason for that. Jesus has spent the last several verses all throughout chapter 12 explaining to people that there's two ways to live. You either live this like vulnerable giving life where instead of relying on yourself and your possessions and your own pride, you rely instead on who God is in your life, right? Don't worry about your life and what you'll eat and what you'll drink, like you rely on God, right? All of this is trying to get people to spend their energy giving themselves over, adhering willfully to the will of God, and kind of giving all that, right? So then it says, I'm here to bring division. So what is, in this sense then, what is going to divide people, right? It's not so much the righteous from the unrighteous, as much as it is those who are willing to see God and not live for that kind of prideful, economic security kind of way of understanding the world, but instead are willing to give over things, give over themselves. That's what's going to divide households. That's what's going to divide people, right? Like, hey, I think that we should only be thinking about ourselves and only be thinking about our own futures and storing up treasures. And others in your household, proverbial or otherwise, who are going to say, no, we should be giving everything away, or we should be living in such a way that is in compliance with, God's love and compassion. We should be, seeing the world through this lens and not through that lens. And that does divide households, right? You can imagine spouses or parents, especially if you imagine let's say a father and a son, just because it talks about that a little bit. It will divide fathers and sons. So you might have one of those either the Father or the Son, saying, we need to store up grain, so to speak. We need to store up treasures in heaven. Could be the Father, could be the Son. And one of them saying, no, we need to be living in a different kind of way. Now, it may not be literal money, but it might be, like this is the way that we should be conducting our business or our life or whatever. This is how we should be looking at our investments, what have you. And it doesn't have to be father and son, could be in any family, right? But all of those people that are listed in this example, fathers and sons, mothers and daughters, in-laws, children and in-laws, all of them have a vested interest because they're all connected financially to how they spend wealth, or how they save up money, or how they spend their time, or how they spend their talents, or how they treat their neighbors, or whether they pay people fairly, whatever, right? All of their well-being is connected to each other, right? Jesus chose in this example people who are reliant on each other in one way, shape, or form. Children are reliant on parents for inheritance, but then parents are also reliant on children in terms of extending the family legacy, or continuing what they have begun because they have to retire, or they pass on, or whatever. These are systems that are all reliant on each other. And so Jesus is trying to point out that, following me is going to divide people in terms of how compassionate, how empathetic, how outward you're going to look, or how inward you're going to look. You're going to store up treasures in this way, or you're going to do this. And that could divide people generationally. And so then it goes into, all of you are good at understanding the times, or understanding what's happening. You can read, like, oh, if this happens, it's probably going to rain. If this happens, it's probably going to be hot. Like, in our modern context, you can flip on the television, or you can look at your phone and kind of know what the weather's going to be like. Or you can just look outside and know, it's getting dark, it's probably going to storm, or the wind's picking up, it's probably going to rain, or, whatever. Like, you can kind of get a sense of the world. You have a good way of knowing how to get a sense of the world. How are you not interpreting what you should be doing? Now, this is the part where you start to think about, well, what would you say about that in terms of a sermon, right? So the hardest part about that is that the tendency would be, one, to say, Jesus is trying to make an example of people who are really, like, the division is going to be between the pious and the unpious. Unpious, not pious, or righteous, or whatever. So it's going to be about the people who can follow what Jesus is saying, the people who are willing to kind of live by some kind of purity standard, and those who don't live by that purity standard. And on some level, that's right, but where I think that kind of way of understanding misses is that it doesn't look directly enough at the context in which this is written. Jesus has spent a lot of time trying to say, you're either going to be a giving person or you're not, right? You're either going to be a trusting person, trusting in God, or you're not, which is different than, are you following the purity standards or moral standards of society at the time? That's different, right? Like, because that's kind of like rule following, minding your P's and Q's, being polite, rather than what does it mean to be kind? What does it mean to give of yourself in whatever ways that means? because we know lots of people who are willing to be very polite and very kind, or very, be very nice in, be, like respectful and know how to do that, and have etiquette. And that's not what Jesus is talking about. Jesus is not talking about whether you know the right fork to use at the dinner table. It's really not even about opening a door for the person next to you, or like taking your hat off for the national anthem. Those are all perfectly fine things to do, but that's not what Jesus is talking about. Jesus is talking about the stuff that either relies on God, or you rely on your own capacity to store up grain. And if you rely on your own capacity to store up grain, then you're never able to see your neighbor as anyone other than someone who wants something from you, and you have to decide how much you're willing to give them while still not putting yourself in a negative position. And that's a daily struggle. That's something that all of us, I think, wrestle with all of the time. The more you have to lose, the more you consider what it means to give anything. And if you really don't have anything to lose, then giving is easier, because you already really didn't have anything. So that, I think, is the point of the text. And that's what's going to bring division. So if there's division in anything, it's societies that are structured on wealth and the retention of wealth, or societies that are structured on giving and making sure that people have what they need. And if you want to talk about interpreting the times, all you have to do is read a newspaper, flip on the news or whatever, and you'll have 6 stories about all of that. Wealth and the retention of wealth, and whether our society is based on one of compassion, grace, and giving or not. But even recognizing that is not the problem. The problem is 2 or 3 or 4 very different ways of thinking about how we solve those problems, and the judgment that we have for those who would solve that or attempt to solve it differently than us. But ultimately, your opinion on how to solve the problem matters a lot less to me, and I think matters less to God. I don't want to speak for God. Then results. Are the people around you, by your actions or the actions of your society, are they better off? Are the poorest people among you getting better off? Are they better off, or are they worse off? Because you being better off or worse off is one thing, and the rich being better off or worse off is one thing. But I think the measure of society is how well are the least of these doing. And that's the struggle. And I think that that's always going to be, if I ask us to look at anything, it's who are the people in front of you advocating for? Who are they advocating for? Are they advocating for themselves? Are they advocating for their neighbors who have just as much or more than they do? Are they advocating for some aspirational group? Like, well, one day we might be rich, and so we want to make sure that or are they advocating for the poor, the least of these, the people who are in the most danger? Any society that doesn't look out for the people in the most amount of danger is missing the mark. So all you have to be able to do is tell me how your perspective does that, and then we work towards that. How do we advocate? How are we advocating for the least of these? That's pretty much it. It's very complicated. I say it like it's simple, and obviously it's not simple. But I think where we struggle the most is by looking out for ourselves and never really looking out for the least of these when we have the capacity to do so, especially when we have the capacity to do so. And that's the division that I think, and that's the fire that I think Jesus is talking about ultimately, is that idea. The reason I'm saying that is because of the setup. Go back to chapter 12 and kind of look to see what it is that Jesus is continually advocating for, right? Letting go of self-preservation, leaning into a kind of vulnerability that depends on God, letting go of the way that we store up things, earthly things, and lean instead on this. And then when Jesus says there's going to be great division, I think that's what Jesus is talking about. That some people are not going to be able to do that and don't see that as in their best interest or their goal. But Jesus is saying, I think, if you're going to follow me, that's going to have to be something that you think about. It's going to have to be your goal. And that's the division. So that's where we are. Okay. So where exactly I go from there, what little piece of that I try to focus on, I don't know yet. It's early in the week. I'll let you know. I'll be in a community garden all week. Maybe that'll give me some good perspective on what Jesus is talking about. So we'll see. Probably. Okay. Well, it's good to be back. Thank you very much for listening to all this. Thank you for continuing to make this a relevant part of the ministry that we do here at Northmont. I hope you have a wonderful week. I hope to see you at the garden. So if you want to volunteer, it's not too late. Just let me know. And I'll see you next time for another First Look. Take care.